Welcome back to the Lift Free and Diet Hard podcast. I'm your host, Andrew Coates. Join me along with industry leaders and friends on a quest to get more people through the gym door and eating and living healthier. Join me where evidence meets empathy while rejecting fitness industry fads and extremism. Let's begin.
This one's a big treat. Brad Schoenfeld, PhD. It's an honor to have you on. And I mean, your bio would be an entire episode of its own, but here are some of the highlights. So I consider you to be one of the preeminent researchers in muscle hypertrophy. You do a lot of that out of your applied muscle development lab. I recently had Dr. Pack on as well, who's been working with you there. And you're a tenured professor at Lehman College. You're the graduate director of the Human Performance and Fitness Program there, author of Science and Development of Muscle Hypertrophy. I have my copy I'm holding up here for the people on video. Great book. And The Max Muscle Plan is another book you've written. And this is really important. You're the brother of my good friend Melody Schoenfeld as well. She's pretty well known in the industry, so it's great to have you on.
Generally, how known as Melody's brother.
All right, let's dive in. Bodybuilders used to believe in the classic 8 to 12 rep range. That was sacred for muscle building. But your research and a lot of other research that's come out has shown that you can build muscle mass at wider rep ranges. What's going on here and what are the conditions that need to be met?
Yeah, so certainly when I was an up-and-coming exercise science student, that's what was taught. There's the NSCA right out of the MSCA textbook is the repetition continuum, which shows that hypertrophy range is in that 6 to 12 rep range. It's been the staple for bodybuilders over time, and certainly I had bought into that. But really a turning point for me was, and there'd been some research before with Dr. Stu Phillips, a terrific researcher out of Canada. His group did a study back, it was 13 years ago now. And he did it in untrained subjects using just the leg extension, but showed that 80%, 30% when trained in failure produced very similar muscle hypertrophy. And in my infinite wisdom back then, I said, come on, Stu, he posted this on social media. I said, come on, Stu. These are untrained subjects just doing leg extension. Don't get jacked from doing spin side. I'm going to carry out this study in trained individuals. You'll see the light loads are not going to be sufficient stimulus. It won't recruit the highest threshold motor units for the type 2 muscle fibers. Long story short, I carried out that study, no difference. And there's been a wealth of research since then over time. We carried out a meta-analysis on this back in 2017, I believe. Again, nothing, and there was a bunch of studies. At that time, there's been many more since then. This almost universal. I mean, many, if not most topics related to variables, you'll see some discrepancies between studies. This is the most one-sided research on variables, at least in the resistance training vernacular. You can really look at any study, and there's, maybe a couple out of several dozen might show some benefits the other way. Again, I would attribute that just to chance findings. So when you get such a wealth of research that shows that really no difference between low load and high load on whole muscle hypertrophy, to me, I think I would say with a very high degree of confidence that is the case. But I will say this, that is whole muscle hypertrophy. I do think the jury is still out. There is less conclusive evidence whether you might be able to achieve differences in type 1 versus type 2 hypertrophy by training with lighter and heavier loads. There's a logical basis for it. Light load training, you're targeting the endurance-based fibers, whereas heavy load training. The evidence is equivocal on that. We carried out a study that would seem to suggest that doesn't occur, but there's been other studies that do. And some of the blood flow restriction training certainly seem to point to type 1 benefits to the light load BFR. Again, I still think on an overall basis, there may be benefits to combining loading ranges. Training in just one or just the other may not optimize. I think you'll get the majority of results, certainly. But if you're a bodybuilder or someone that's looking to maximize results, could there be beneficial effects of combining loading ranges? I still think the jury is out.
This episode is brought to you by Macros First. I've always struggled with nutrition tracking apps, even the slightest hassle or friction, and it breaks my habit. That changed with Macros First. When I tried it, I told my friend, the founder, Jacob, quote, this is, let's just call it a certain other app on steroids. It's the easiest app to use, and it has a free barcode scanner. which if you use tracking apps, you know this is a really big deal. I recommend Macros First to all my clients and friends, and even had them sponsor my 2024 conference. Here's an example feature that I love. The verified food database. Remember using other apps and searching for a food only to find 10 to 50 similar options with different macros, not knowing which one to pick? This kind of friction is the shit that made me quit tracking altogether. Macros First, every single food item in the database, over 3 million of them, is human verified. No junk entries, so you can trust the numbers. Plus, that free barcode scanner makes logging faster. And if the barcode doesn't turn anything up, just point your camera at the nutrition label and Macros First will extract all the nutrition info instantly. All this just makes tracking easier. Macros First is free on the Apple App Store or Google Play. And if you use the code Andrew, all caps, my first name, you'll get an extended free trial of Macros First Premium. That unlocks a bunch of features that make tracking way easier and faster.
What are some of the important constraints? Because it's not like someone can just do light loads all day long. They have to get near failure. And what's the minimum and maximum kind of percentage of your 1 rep max? That seems to be where the evidence is pointing.
Yeah, I don't like to talk, Crystal, in terms of 1 rep max, because especially as you get into the lower percentages, the variance, the inter-individual variability is huge. So we carried out a study where we looked, there was an EMG study, but we looked at 75% versus 30% one arm in the leg press in trained subjects. And the variability at 10 reps of 10 RM was 7 reps, right? When I say 75% one RM was 7 reps to 21 reps. And the variability in the 30% one RM was, my memory serves, 21 reps to 72 reps. So there's just such a wide range when you start getting into the lighter load that I think really where you want to go is to look at a submaximal RM. And to me, certainly we have evidence up to 30, 35 reps. There's not much difference. And as you said, it's predicated on going to failure or close to failure. I was involved in a study with a group in Brazil where we looked at 20% one RM, but the average was 76 reps, I believe. And that it showed diminished hypertrophy. But look, I think at that point, most of the individuals were giving up before they're giving up probably out of boredom before they got to failure.
And it's pretty just unpleasant to train in such high rep ranges, certainly for a lot of it. So there's always the practical implications. I wrote an article on my website that kind of gets into this stuff. You know, I see sometimes there's people advocating that you only need to train really low rep to near failure. And I mean, I still am of the camp because I actually coach full-time in person and I train myself. And I'm also a taller lifter. So I think anthropometry, which is just limb length stuff, is relevant here, where I'm just not convinced that like your 5 rep max to near failure for something like a dumbbell curl or maybe a seated or like a seated leg extension or, shoulder laterals. I just don't think that's functionally very practical. And certainly, in my experience, it's beaten up my joints if I've ever even tried to dare get near that stuff.
Yeah, I would agree that heavy loads do not mix well with particularly single joint movements.
Yeah. Whereas, I've definitely found if I hop into a pendulum squat, hack squat machine or whatever, and because you can get pretty close to failure on, say, like a 6 rep max. And, I get really good tension off of that. And it's a tough training effect. So that bleeds into the next concept. We also used to believe that heavier, low rep stuff, training was disproportionately fatiguing on our nervous system, CNS. Now, it looks like, as I understand, the research points to the fact that the higher repetition stuff is actually more fatiguing. What's going on there?
This episode is brought to you by Renaissance Periodization and the RP Hypertrophy app. RP is the industry leader in muscle building, coaching, and education. This app is like having a coach in your pocket. It gives you everything you need, including training programs, form videos. It gives you all your sets, reps, and weights, so you just show up and follow the plan. It adjusts each week based off your progress. And the app was created by Dr. Mike Israetel, Nick Shaw, and the team at RP, who I've known for many years. And the entire team are incredible people who've always been supportive and generous with me, so I know their character and are easy to endorse. My library contains several RP books, and I've used RP training principles in my workouts and coaching with my clients for many years, long before the explosion in popularity of their YouTube channel, which is worth checking out. RP is the first sponsor I felt remotely comfortable endorsing after over 7 years of podcasting. And if hiring a one-on-one coach isn't for you, Using the RP Hypertrophy app is the next best thing to maximize your gains and take the guesswork out of your program. And there's a 30-day money-back guarantee, so you can try it risk-free. If you don't like it, they'll give you your money back. And I've also got a serious discount for you of up to $50 US. Go to rpstrength.com/coats and use the code COATSRP, or go to the link below in the show notes, and that's rpstrength.com/coats. Use the code COATSRP.
Yeah, so it really depends upon your definition of fatigue is and how it's measured. So there's been some studies that have looked at heavy load versus light load, and they look at EMG, what the drop off in the EMG is, but it's between sets, first of all. So it's looking, I don't put much stock in that. I don't put much stock in the practical implications of that. What are we really gaining from that knowledge? The evidence does show, certainly that I've seen, that it doesn't carry over. It's not recovery. People think of fatigue, that it's going to impact your recovery for the next session, and there's no evidence that that's the case. We also have, as mentioned, a lot of evidence that training with light loads versus heavy loads produces similar whole muscle hypertrophy over long periods of time. So the fatigue did not impair any results one way or the other there. And I'll say this, there's even with the acute studies, you have to remember that there is an adaptive process that comes along. So when we carried out that study with trained subjects, one group did 8 to 12 reps, the other did 25 to 35 reps. The group doing the 25 to 35 reps were half of them puked during the first week of the study. But over time, they adapt. Like after the first week or so, we didn't really get any complaints or any issues in that regard. Now, you still might not like it. There's certainly there's more acidosis that's built up. Even if you're able to buffer it to a greater extent, there's still discomfort. And I think you also have to look at the type of fatigue. Is it peripheral fatigue versus central fatigue? So these types of discussions, I think, need to be contextualized. I think they're a lot of times overblown, and I think they're improperly discussed. The ramifications of them are improperly discussed, because I don't think, based on certainly the evidence that we have through longitudinal research and certainly my experience, the fatigue aspect is anything that impacts your results over time.
I've got a few thoughts of this. One is, I think fatigue is something that you learn to adapt to fatigue. I mean, you have to learn how to handle hard training. That's an important part of this stuff anyway. And again, one of the theories that I have is when you combine the first question, which is the understanding that you can build muscle at, lower rep, heavier load, and two, this boogeyman and fear of fatigue, especially this interpretation that high reps disproportionately cause CNS fatigue, then that's led to this, I think, this questionable conclusion that lower rep heavy loading is optimal for muscle building. So, and I've seen this suggestion gain popularity. So what do you think about that? Break it down.
Zero evidence. And as I mentioned, I think there's at least a logical basis that there's some evidence that combining rep ranges may help to enhance the hypertrophic response. Admittedly, it's weak. Now, remember that evidence exists on a continuum. I think one of the big problems that we have, particularly in the influencer age and social media, is that people are looking for hard answers to questions that we have limited evidence on. And you can only, certainly when I give my opinion, I'm giving it with the relevant uncertainty that's surrounding the evidence. So many of the topics, if not most, carry a decent amount, if not a lot, of uncertainty that you get differential findings, conflicting findings between studies. Zero evidence that there's an optimal rep range. And there's some evidence that combining them may help to optimize. Ultimately, I don't think it really probably matters much. Certainly to the average lifter, is going to matter much for a bodybuilder, high-level athlete, or someone who just wants to eke out every gain they can from resistance training. I think in the absence of evidence and the fact that there is at least some evidence without any downside, it certainly, in my opinion, makes sense to do some combined training as far as the loading ranges. And I think if nothing else too, it helps take the lighter load training, helps take stress off the joints to some extent. So it's more joint friendly.
That's been my experience as well. So with all that being said, what is the best current understanding of the relationship between volume and muscle hypertrophy?
Well, I mean, the literature shows pretty clear dose-response relationship, at least up to a certain point. And there's been multiple meta-analyses that have looked at that. And there's now quite a large body of literature that constitutes both trained and untrained subjects in different populations. I think that needs to be contextualized to some extent too. With the older individuals, there does seem to be impaired recovery. At least that's certainly anecdotally seen, and there's some evidence of that. And I think that the evidence would suggest that you probably, as you get older, certainly I think that's something I've experienced, that using high volumes is not as friendly as it was when I was younger.
I'm starting to notice it too. Yep.
But up to a certain point, there certainly is a dose-response relationship. Now, we just published a paper, which wasn't really surprising per se, but even these were in trained lifters, and they got quite good results just doing 4 to 6 sets per muscle cell, basically single set routines, twice a week. The sessions lasted a half an hour, so 1 hour total training time, and they got impressive muscle growth. Now, it wasn't quite as good as we generally see in our longitudinal studies, but it was certainly good enough where I don't think that anyone who was in the gen pop would be complaining about that. Again, that wouldn't be the way you train as a bodybuilder based on the evidence, and certainly based upon anecdotally what's been noted. But I think the take home is you'll get the majority of gains from a minimum dose, minimum effective dose workout. Probably Pat probably talked about that. I would hope.
Yep.
When where a lot of the research that I've done for the most part has been for bodybuilders and people that just want to get maximum jack. And when that's the case, when you want to eke out all of your potential gains, you need to be much more cognizant of the variables and manipulation. So I think ultimately it comes down to who's the population and what is the extent of time you're willing, not only your goals, but what amount of time do you want to put in, because the exponential increases, you start getting higher and higher volumes, it's an exponential increase in training time. Many people are not willing to commit that time.
And I've noticed there seems to be, like you said, more evidence that even just a fairly minimal dose is very beneficial. And I think what sometimes people misunderstand is they falsely equate that with, but that's also optimal, when in fact, there's definitely significant diminishing returns based upon effort and volume, but you are still incrementally eking things out. And as you alluded to, the person who is trying to optimize, which of course is the competitive bodybuilding side, or people who want to be maximally jacked like me, we're probably going to bias towards, I don't necessarily feel like I need to live at maximum recoverable volume, but I'm definitely going to be further along that continuum than minimum effective dose, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I think that people sometimes confuse what is appreciable versus what is optimal. That's certainly something that you need to distinguish between that. And what I'd also say is that there's not been any research that has shown that lower volumes are superior to the higher volumes. Now, here's another thing I think that's important to bring up here, is that people talk about overtraining. You really have very little evidence in resistance training programs of overtraining that occurs. Now, I'm not saying it wouldn't occur. I think part of the issue is that even in the quote unquote high volume studies, the overall amount of volume is not that high. Like the old Arnold Schwarzenegger routines were 250 to 300 sets per week. I mean, he was doing autobiography, and he did over 100 sets of calf raises alone per week when he was trying to bring up his calves. So he was doing this massively high volume. In contrast, the quote unquote high volume studies that you see generally are relegated to a few muscle groups. So they're not like, we're talking 100 total sets for all the exercises in a given week, which is a third of what you'd see in some of the old school routines. So I think it would be pretty hard to see overtraining, particularly over the relatively short training periods. But that said, I think the human body is a lot more resilient than people give it credit for. So you thought that you need to use lower volumes to avoid overtraining. I mean, at some point, I certainly think that is the case, but very low volumes versus moderate to higher volumes, I don't think that is an issue virtually certainly the majority of lifters out there.
I think there's a couple things that are baked into this discussion, especially mentioning Arnold. First of all, there is survivorship bias in any singular anecdote. Pack and I talked about some of the anecdotes of your Mike Menser and Dorian Yates in terms of how whenever anybody cites a lower volume training, they only really have two classical examples, and then they pretend to ignore the fact that the 95+% of bodybuilders over time actually go out the other way. But on the extreme ends, in Arnold, he's also an example of survivorship bias where he's someone who had a successful career, obviously just genetics and cutting edge drugs. And Pack and I again talked about these things, but any singular example is probably an edge of the bell curve outlier anyway when we're talking about these people, right?
No question. I was bringing Arnold up. I mean, was he overtrained? My point is, was he actually overtrained? So my point is, he was doing 3 times the amount, threefold amount of volume that we see in the studies that we have. And there's certainly no evidence of that. Or maybe he was, like he could have been overtrained. Certainly didn't show in his placings, but I mean, and by the way, it's not like he was a unicorn in that. There was a lot of the old school bodybuilders, that was very common to be trained. Serge Nubret trained with higher volumes. I don't know this, but Arnold says in his, he talked about training 3 to 4 hours a day, 6 days a week. He said that Lou Ferrigno was doing 5 hours a day at that time to beat him. So who knows? I think like you said, anecdotes, that's why I'm researching. We carry out controlled research to try to put these things to the test and draw conclusions. But bring that back home, we don't have good, I think the upper threshold is going to be highly individual. I think we see when we carry out research, the responses are very different between individuals. Some people seem to thrive on somewhat lower vibes. Does that mean they wouldn't get greater results with a higher vibe? Maybe, maybe not, because we don't give them the higher vibes. So these are things that I think warrant more attention. But to me, I think the biggest take-home message is that somewhat minimum effective dose, which is like 4 to 6 sets per week, can provide a majority of your gains. And by the way, in the study that we just carried out, we had one group trained to failure and the other trained to 2 RIR. And there was modestly greater hypertrophy in the failure group, but the 2 RIR overall got quite good gains. So it's not even predicating that you have to train to failure. So a training strategy.
I think there's one more dimension in the Arnold conversation too, is the total allostatic load. Joel James and I just talked about that recently on a recent podcast. And you said recovery, right? So in Arnold's case, a lot of their contemporaries, their full-time job was bodybuilding, right? So now again, there's also the stories about Arnold and Franco Colombo doing like construction work, yard work in their early days too. So that's actually pretty physical. But in a lot of these cases of these figures, especially competitive bodybuilders, it was their full-time job. And if we compare that against the general population person who actually has a lot of life stress, total allostatic load, cumulative stress at all dimensions. So that taps into your full capacity recovery. So it's worth at least considering when you consider the total amount of volume, but I think you did more than adequate justice to the conversation. So next piece of this that I wanted, we used to believe that muscle hypertrophy had 3 core components: mechanical tension, metabolic stress, and muscle damage. Now, I'm certainly of the impression the evidence has shifted towards mechanical tension being overwhelmingly the primary driver, and the other 2, there's some nuance. So could you break down just how important they all are?
Yeah, I don't think there's any question that mechanical tension is the primary driver. Without mechanical tension, I think you're going to have minimal growth over time. The question has always been, are other mechanisms potentially relevant and synergistic, which is where I think there's some conflicting evidence, and I think the jury is still out. So look, I know we're in the internet age and people it's always good. People like when you're very firm and have a strong opinion on something, but the evidence is quite weak on both ends to refute or to provide contributory evidence on this. And here's the issue, or a primary issue, is that it's very difficult to tease out mechanisms. So when you alter one mechanism, let's say mechanical tension, that's going to ultimately alter other mechanisms, metabolic stress, muscle damage. And when you try to do that in a controlled fashions, particularly in humans, in vivo, in the living, it becomes more and more difficult. So a lot of the research we're trying to extrapolate from vitro research, test tube, rodent data, which is using protocols that are not at all ecologically valid, that have very little resemblance to what resistance training in humans involves. So what I would say is, so I wrote a paper. I know that I know my paper, the mechanisms of muscle hypertrophy, is one of the most cited resistance training papers in history. And it was my master's capstone project, published in 2010. And we've gotten a lot more knowledge. So I discussed the potential mechanisms, mechanical tension, metabolic stress, and muscle damage. And we've gotten certainly a lot more knowledge. And I think, if anything, it strengthened the belief that mechanical tension is overwhelmingly the primary factor. But I still think we're far cry from being able to provide good or high levels of confidence of our recommendations on the other variables. Metabolic stress, number one, there's many metabolites that are produced during exercise, hundreds. And in resistance training alone, there's several dozen that have been identified, and that they certainly haven't been studied. The primary one that's been studied has been lactate. Lactate has been shown to be quite anabolic in vitro and test tubes, even in ex vivo and even in vivo and with certain rodent models, but there's conflicting evidence against that too. So again, I don't think that we can draw any good conclusions there. And I would also say that certainly there's no evidence that there would be an additive effect with resistance training, but there's no evidence that it wouldn't really. No, in my opinion, no compelling evidence. There was one human trial that injected lactate into the bloodstream, but that's not necessarily specific to muscle tissue where the signaling would be relevant. So does it actually affect the muscle in that regard? So again, there's just a lot of limitations of the research with a lot of other metabolites that have been studied. I would say that if metabolic stress is a factor, it would be minimal to small effects, but could that be important for bodybuilders? Potentially. Muscle damage, I've become less, if there's one that I've become less interested in, is muscle damage. So here's the issue. Certainly there's evidence that muscle damage drives various factors that are involved in hypertrophy. Number one, it upregulates satellite cell activity in satellite cells. It's well documented. They have a very large role, play a very large role in hypertrophy. There's various interleukins that are involved, that the macrophages, which again have been shown to promote hypertrophy. Anyway, there's even reactive oxygen species are produced. Here's the rub, though. The more recent evidence suggests that you need a lot of muscle damage to show those effects. So my hypothesis was that, well, obviously, if you have severe muscle damage, it's got to be a negative. There's no question. You're not going to be able to train effectively. I mean, if you're walking out of the gym like Frankenstein, getting to lift your arms, that's going to have negative ramifications on your ability to train. If you're not training, you're going to see negative effects. So net negative, if there's a lot of muscle damage. The question is, if you can induce some more mild to perhaps moderate muscle damage that wouldn't affect your training, which it wouldn't, conceivably, could there be an additive benefit? But some of the newer evidence suggests that you don't get those same benefits. When I say same benefits, those you're not upregulating the satellite cell activation. You're not affecting the macrophages to the same extent, and thus, what other factors are going to be involved that would drive hypertrophy? So it's given me pause. Again, am I willing to dismiss it? Not necessarily yet. I think we still need more evidence, but I think the jury is.
So if I understand correctly, you could add some depth to this. So satellite cell donate their nuclei to the muscle cells. This is actually a very important component of muscle memory, whereby it's easier going back a second later time to rebuild muscle mass, and the satellite cells have a big effect on that. I believe you can add, but by that logic, could there be some benefit to occasionally training to where you're creating more muscle damage with that kind of intensity, just not doing it that frequently, and then perhaps you would get the benefit? Is there anything mechanistically that makes sense there?
Well, so then you'd have to say you're going to need to take off a decent amount of time. So let's say you get really sore, and that's going to be certainly that will help with your satellite cell activation and perhaps proliferation to a greater extent. But you might need to take off 3, 4, 5 days. Is that going to be effective in your ability to then recapitulate muscle protein synthesis? So again, these are questions that research is not answering. So what you're proposing is a speculative hypothesis, and I couldn't refute that. I think I can try to poke holes in it, but I think that's something that we can say, again, the jury is definitely out on.
It logically sort of seems like, certainly the way that I've trained in the past, where occasionally you get your buddies together and you just have a really intense session, or anecdotally based on what you see with bodybuilders. So I don't know. It just mechanistically, I'm like, that's interesting. But again, I'm just curious if there's any data on it. To me, what I've sort of thought about a pump is that even if there's not necessarily a big part that's a driver of muscle hypertrophy, it's definitely concurrent with a good pump is a good sign, because you probably create a lot of mechanical tension. It's generally speaking something that, whether it's a byproduct of training or a driver, it's still good. Whereas muscle damage, as you said, you probably want to walk a fine line with it and not absolutely crush yourself. So I'm satisfied with that. And that seems to line up with practical application.
Yeah. So, I mean, we published a review paper on the pump and provided certain hypothetical rationale why that may help to promote hypertrophy. Certainly in the test tube, hydrating a cell is highly anabolic, and actually it's anti-catabolic, which is a hypertrophy home run. It's continue over time, but you can't necessarily extrapolate conclusions from test tube to in vivo and in humans, in vivo results. So I don't dispute what you're saying. I just think that there's other ways. Mechanical tension is a somewhat misunderstood topic, which is beyond the scope. You'd have time, or be a whole hour of discussion. But anyway, but this friend is active tension, is passive tension. Is we have the magnitude of tension versus the time tension integral. How long is the tension carried out for versus having very high amounts of tension for shorter periods of time? So a lot to unpack with that. And I think that these are things that, again, are just not, as much as we have internet influencers who love to pontificate about exact ways that these can be put into practice, there's so much we still don't know. I think that we need to use some caution when we start to talk about these things.
It's one of the reasons why I'm very, very loath to speak assertively, even on muscle hypertrophy at all on social media anymore, just because it seems like it's quite combative and full of a lot of absolute statements. So you've alluded to this several times. Is there anything popular in the current muscle hypertrophy zeitgeist that you find very misleading, highly overrated, or just blatantly false?
I mean, just off the top of my head, I think the main thing is that we have people that are promoting a certain way to train. And that is really goes against everything we know, both through science and through anecdote, that hypertrophy can be achieved with many different strategies. There's many roads lead to gains, and we spell gains with a Z, of course, because that's but yeah, there's a lot of people that want to sell programs that have this exact program that you have to follow without either understanding, or even worse, perhaps understanding and just doing it despite that fact. There's no optimal training program. There's only conceivably optimal training program for a given individual. So people respond differently. We can't say, so we've kind of touched on some of these, that there's a best rep range, or that there's a best volume, or that there's, best frequency of training. So many it depends that are involved here. And what you also have to remember is that when you manipulate variables, generally you're going to be affecting other variables. So let's say you're manipulating load. So you're going to compare high load, heavy load versus light load. how are you going to equate volume? So you can equate it by sets. You both do the same amount of sets, but then the volume load is going to be skewed to the higher rep group because they're doing a lot more load, and that's, I mean, a lot more reps. But even with the lighter load, that's going to generally promote, assuming you're going to failure. Or you can not go to failure, which of course would be, you can just do the same number of reps with light versus heavy. Was that would be kind of silly because we know that proximity to failure is probably the most important factor that drives hypertrophy. So all of these things need to be taken into context. There is no best routine. Like I said, only a best routine for a given individual. What I would leave you with there is that you need to be cognizant of what we know through research. A true evidence-based practitioner, professional will understand the research, understand its limitations. Extremely important. Not cherry picked. You got to be objective about it, not let your personal biases come into play, which often do with certain individuals. And then you then need to take into account your personal expertise in combination with the needs and abilities of the individual, whether that's yourself or a client you're working with. And you create different programs based on different individuals, based on the science, based on your expertise.
That makes a lot of sense. Practical. So another thing that we sometimes hear people talk about is tempo in the tempo of reps. And I've recently seen some discussion on how, well, I feel confident saying that slower tempos past a certain point don't have any advantages. I think we used to believe if you do extra slow, especially extra slow eccentrics, that it was somehow more hypertrophic. I don't think the evidence supports that anymore. But I'm even seeing some suggestion now that eccentrics may not even be, and the negative phase of a lift for anybody may not be as important to muscle hypertrophy. What's the evidence saying there?
Yeah, it's apropos that you bring that up. So our group is just finishing up a meta-analysis on that topic, and we've just gotten the analysis. So I can tell you that really no differences. Faster, slower, both concentric, eccentric, at least the way it's been studied in the literature, has very little effects. Now, what I would also say is that just logically, so can you just drop the weight and see good results? He said, no, there has to be at least logically, you have to lower it using the muscular, lengthening it with the muscles, tension in the muscles. If you're just like some people just are pumping the weights up and down, where ultimately the eccentric action is not getting any tension as it's going down. And that, as we know, mechanical tension is the primary driver of hypertrophy. That would go against any logical basis that we would have that would be beneficial or not. Certainly would seem to be detrimental. But assuming that you're lower and under control, and you could do that second or perhaps a little less, doesn't seem to be much of any difference, both concentrically and eccentric.
No, I mean, I don't know if this actually makes sense, but one of the suggestions I've heard is that we are stronger on an eccentric contraction, lowering than a concentric. So for example, someone who cannot yet physically do a push-up, you can probably get into the top position of a push-up, lower yourself down, get stuck at the bottom, and then crawl back up again, right? So does this make any sense? Because I've heard this suggestion that because we are, I've heard numbers like 40, I don't know if this is accurate, but something like, let's say 40% stronger on an eccentric. By that logic, if we're lifting a weight that is challenging to near failure on the concentric portion, that we would technically be underloading and not near failure on the eccentric. I mean, I think this is mental gymnastics personally, but can you tease that out?
So I mean, it's not underloading because you're loading properly or optimally, maximally under the concentric action. You are underloading for the eccentric action.
Yes.
That is true. Now, there is some evidence that doing eccentric, like accentuated eccentric overload, may be beneficial from a hypertrophic standpoint. Again, there are limitations to how some of these studies are carried out because how are you equating volume and load? So is it additional volume? Is it heavy load? So what I would say is that there is, in my opinion, good enough evidence where that would be a strategy that you can experiment with. Everyone becomes their own N equals 1 of them. And that experimenting with some eccentric overload can be a potentially hypertrophic, could potentially be of hypertrophic benefit. By the way, it had been also thought that muscle damage may be a contributing factor there as well because eccentric actions promote greater muscle damage and eccentric overload would tend to overload muscle in a way that would cause more muscle damage. Again, can we refute that? No. So I think it is something worthy of experimentation. Some of the evidence does suggest that there may be a benefit, but again, I think the evidence on the spectrum or the continuum is still moderate, weak to moderate. Certainly, we don't have strong evidence that that is.
I think an underlying theme here is most of what we talked about is very nuanced, and it's very hard to create firm conclusions and strong positions about these things. How about
The number of followers I have is not higher because they talk in too much uncertainty to drive the internet algorithms high.
Yeah.
And people certainly don't like that. So,
you have a lot of followers regardless? Now, what about, are there any differences between how men and women respond to volume of training? I think there's certainly strong anecdotal evidence you can provide even more that women seem to recover a little better faster and seem to tolerate higher volumes. Now, my interpretation of that is women on average, because women on average have less muscle mass, then on average they are using lighter loads relative to failure, and therefore it's less disruptive to muscle tissue, less absolute load, less disruptive muscle tissue and nervous system. So is there anything merit to that?
well, so a couple things there. Certainly, women have been shown to have better "quote unquote" recovery. That's not really has been shown as much from a volume perspective, more in terms of the ability to maintain a certain number of reps with shorter rest periods. That's been shown. The problem is we don't have, and these are acute studies. We have very little research on women overall. It's a sad fact that when I try to carry out studies, most of our studies now we have men and women. It's like 70% men. We try to recruit as many, hopefully we get even, but just doesn't work out that way. And thus having specific research in women is very challenging, particularly muscle building research. Women tend to gravitate towards fat loss. If you have a fat loss study, yeah, they're all signing up. But it's hard for me at our university, and I assume similar across the nation, to get women involved. And just most of the volumes or research we have has been on men. So I don't think we can draw conclusions, but I think that is a viable, worthy of speculation, viable hypothesis. And I think that's certainly has been part of the speculation why women have better "quote unquote" recovery with shorter rest, because the absolute loads that they use are less, that they're able to maintain a higher percentage of their repetitions on the successive set.
Certainly, anecdotally, in my experience, coaching full-time for 15 years, I have an online women's group program. They seem to enjoy and tolerate supersetting very well, right? Compared to men on average. Now, there are clearly exceptions, but it's just something I've noticed, and it's a fairly large pool of anecdotal data there. But I tend to just give people what they enjoy.
Yeah, again, anecdotally, I would agree, but certainly an area that's more in need of research at this point is the response of women, particularly from a hypertrophy standpoint, to various variables.
Wonderful. Is there a genetic ceiling to how much muscle mass people can put on? And obviously this is on a bell curve for sure, but certainly with natural lifters.
Yeah, no question there's a genetic ceiling. I don't think you can think that's arguable. But the question is, do people actually reach their genetic ceiling? And I would say probably not. Certainly you're going to get closer to it, but there's no way you can actually ever study that, because there's always different things that can be done. How do you know you're doing everything you could based on your genetics? And maybe as we get more into genetic testing, there'll be ways that we can optimize genetics to a better extent. But I think certainly at this point, look, I've worked with very high caliber bodybuilders that have been training for 20 plus years and been able to enhance their muscle development over a period of time. Now it's much slower. You might get 1 or 2 pounds of muscle over a 3 or 6 month period, but they're still gaining muscle at a very advanced state, which by doing different things that they had been doing.
Wonderful. I mentioned satellite cells and muscle memory earlier. Can you elaborate on any practical implications so that people understand, especially you get someone who built a muscle before, they're struggling to come back into the gym. Is it easier to build muscle the second go round?
Yeah, there is some controversy in this area. So it used to be believed that you talked about how satellite cells could donate their myonuclei.
Yep.
So muscle is a multinucleated cell, meaning that it has multiple nuclei, and that allows it to produce more proteins. And as you start getting more and more well-trained, the capacity for your myonuclei to produce proteins becomes tapped out, and you need more myonuclei to continue to support greater muscle building. And thus, that's where satellite cells, one of the factors, by the way, satellite cells have other muscle building effects that have been shown. There's communication, anyway, I don't want to bog down this in the other factor. Addition of myonuclei is a very important one, conceivably. And it had been thought that when you detrain, when you stop training, the myonuclei that you gained would be lost, and you'd have to then retrain again. And some of the newer research suggests that isn't the case. A lot of that was rodent data, but they've shown that to some extent in powerlifters who use metabolic steroids, where they maintain myonuclei over 4 years to a higher extent than non-steroid users. There's other groups that have challenged that theory. I think that it does seem to me that at least certainly some of the myonuclei are maintained, whether you're retaining all your myonuclei. Perhaps there's other conditions that are involved. I think these are things that we still don't have a great handle on, but certainly the concept of muscle memory is real. How long you can go is still a question, right, while maintaining the myonuclei. But yeah, it certainly becomes easier to get back what you had rather than building new muscle from the start.
I suppose there's also the practical implication of as we age, past a certain age, and I've read different places, whether it's 30, 35, or 40, we do see a natural decrease in muscle mass. And as you alluded to earlier, we have a diminished capacity to recover. So at a certain point, these things are going to intersect and bang against each other, right?
Yeah, satellite cell capacity decreases as negative factors that make it more difficult to gain muscle. Testosterone levels in men decrease, estrogen levels in women. So there's multiple factors that are going to go against you as you age. But the good news is that even though there's diminished response to training, you can continue to certainly maintain muscle to what you had when you were younger to a good extent into your 40s, 50s, 60s, and beyond. And even, we did a meta-analysis on the oldest of the old, 75 plus, and they'd never, these are people that were sedentary or they trained very minimally. So basically untrained individuals, they gain really appreciable amounts of muscle, 15% in 8 to 12 weeks of muscle mass, particularly leg muscle mass, which has huge functional ramifications. Now, of course, at that point, they'd already lost a good amount of muscle. So you have to look at that respect too, that they're starting from a much lower baseline.
That was one of my thoughts is that muscle memory in of itself just from like the natural amount they had, or is that newly built muscle? I don't think it matters, but either way, it's good that people can build muscle at any age.
Correct.
Great. This has been a masterclass. Brad, I really appreciate you coming on. People can follow you on your social media that is not polarizing on Instagram at Brad Schoenfeld, PhD. Are there any other resources you want to direct people to?
No, I'd just say if you want to find out more about me, Google me. So general tarities that you'll find all the information.
There's a lot. And again, this is a textbook. This is university level textbook, really. But if anybody's really interested in the science of this stuff, the science and development of muscle hypertrophy, that book is fantastic. And then the Max Muscle, let me make sure I got the title right. Max Muscle Plan is definitely a bit more for the general audience, more layman's terms. So again, thank you for coming on, and everybody listening, go check out what Brad is doing. And I promise I will bring your sister Melody on in the not too distant future. She's been a guest on before, and it's an honor. The 360s on episodes, I finally got you on. We've spoken at a couple of conferences together. It's always great to see you in person. So I'll definitely see you in our travel. So thank you so much.